Are you struggling today with loneliness? Has someone hurt or betrayed you, maybe even left you and just completely turned their back on you? Maybe a husband, maybe a boyfriend, okay, maybe a family member, and you feel so isolated and so alone. Or maybe you're having to start over. You've had to move and start over in a new community. Maybe you've had to leave even family and friends behind. Girl, if that is you, listen, this is what I want you to know. God wants to use your struggle to make you stronger. As we continue today our series, The 7 Struggles That God Uses, the 7 struggles that will make you stronger, we're going to talk about struggle number 2, and that struggle is isolation. Isolation. Listen, Jesus went through it. Moses went through it. Many of the Bible characters went through this, and you and I will go through this as well. These seasons of isolations where we struggle and feel so alone. What God wants to do in our lives is He wants to make us stronger women of God. And struggle number 2 is designed to make you stronger, even as you struggle with it. What we're going to look at today is one of my favorite Bible characters from the Old Testament, Joseph. If you know his story, and I'm sure probably many of you are familiar with that, you know he struggled with isolation many years as he was in a foreign land in Egypt. His brothers had betrayed him, sold him into slavery, and he went at the age of 17 into Egypt, where he lived for many years, absolutely away from his family and from all of his friends there in Canaan. And he must have struggled, I'm sure, with isolation. We know God had a purpose for that. We know God wanted to save eventually Jacob and those other sons. He wanted to save the nation of Israel. There was a purpose in that. We know there's a purpose in all these struggles that God allows us to go through. But in Joseph's life, what I want you to see is what Psalm 105 says about the purpose, why God allowed him to go through this struggle with isolation. And in Psalm chapter 105, it says this in verse 16. It says that God called for a famine in the land of Canaan, and He cut off their food supply. Then He sent someone to Egypt. Joseph, okay? He sent him to Egypt. He was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters. They placed his neck in an iron collar until the time came to fulfill his dreams. Listen, God has a dream and a plan for your life. It says, until that time came, the Lord tested, and that word means refined, Joseph's character. What I want you to know is when God allows you to struggle with isolation, He wants to refine your character. And there are 4 characteristics in Joseph's life that we want to look at today. And they're the 4 characteristics that God wants to refine and develop in your life as you struggle with isolation. And that first characteristic is purity. Personal purity or sexual purity. You know that when Joseph was sold into slavery, a man named Potiphar bought him, a wealthy man who had a very immoral wife. And she tried to seduce Joseph many times, but every single time he never would give in, until the point where finally Potiphar's wife became so frustrated with him that she told her own husband that Joseph had raped her. And that led to Joseph being unjustly imprisoned. But Joseph upheld his personal purity. He would not give in. He would not succumb to that. And listen, when you're alone and isolated, it's easy to take shortcuts. You're alone, and it's easy to say, well, maybe I just ought to go live with my boyfriend. Maybe I just ought to invite somebody that perhaps wouldn't be a good influence upon your life to live with you or whatever. It's a time when you can get involved in a lot of things that can absolutely cause you to compromise your own personal purity. I want to tell you something. Hang on. Hang on. God is trying to develop personal, sexual purity in your life as you struggle with loneliness, as you struggle with isolation. Stand firm and stay pure. Well, the second characteristic that we see in Joseph's life is integrity. And we see this in Genesis chapter 39, verse 19 to 23. As Joseph was thrown into that jail, it wasn't very long after that the jailer noticed that Joseph had a great work ethic and a lot of integrity, and that he was a responsible young man. And before too long, Joseph was basically put in charge of that whole jail. One of the things God wants to develop in our lives when we go through isolation is He wants to develop our work ethic and our integrity. He wants to see if He can test our character so that we don't become unproductive and lazy and defeated and maybe just give into depression where we just have a real inability to get things done. Okay, we just let ourselves just kind of go in every area of our lives. Girls, God wants to develop personal integrity and a work ethic in our lives during these seasons of isolation. I can think about many years ago when I was going through a season of isolation, and I felt like I just didn't have anything to do, and I was focusing on my hurt and my isolation. And then God began to show me all around my house there were things that needed to be done, and one of those things was curtains. I made curtains for lots of the windows in my house. I sat down at the sewing machine that I hadn't sat at in years. And girls, listen, God used that season of my life to help me be real productive around my home. God wants you also to be productive where you are, to develop integrity, to be responsible during this season of isolation, and to excel in the areas where He has placed you and enabled you to have opportunities. Girls, develop personal integrity. Number 3, service to others. Service to others. Listen, Joseph, while he was in jail, of course, he used his gift to interpret dreams for that cupbearer and that baker. And eventually, one of those men, the cupbearer, was able to remember him and tell Pharaoh about him, which is, of course, led to Joseph's release and then to his promotion as the second in command there to Pharaoh. Use your spiritual gifts while you're isolated. It's easy to want to unplug from church and from service to others and service to God. But girls, during these seasons of isolation, use your spiritual gift. I don't know what your gifts may be. Maybe you can sing. Maybe you can be part of a worship ministry at your church. Or maybe you teach. Or maybe you're an exhorter. Maybe you're just great with kids and you can work with youth. Pour yourself in to serving others. That's what Joseph did there in that jail. And it led eventually to God being able to fulfill God's great dream and plan for Joseph's life. The 4th characteristic that God wants to develop in our lives as we struggle with isolation is this. It is forgiveness. The ability to forgive others. Over and over again we see in the Genesis account of Joseph's life that he forgave his brothers. They even doubted that he could forgive them, but he forgave them. And listen, God wants you to forgive those who have hurt you as well. God wants me to forgive them. And I will tell you something, that's not easy. But you can do it. You can do it. And if you want God to bless you and to forgive you, He requires you to forgive unconditionally, as you have also been forgiven unconditionally by Him. Sometimes forgiveness, you forgive one day, then you begin to think about it again and stew over maybe your circumstances. You've got to forgive again and again and again, okay? It's a process many times. But girls, listen, God wants to use your struggle to make you stronger. And forgiveness is one of the best characteristics He can teach you. Well, girls, if you've ever struggled with isolation, if you've ever been through that, I would sure love to hear from you. Post your comment. Tell me about what you've been through and what God taught you. Or if you're struggling right now with isolation, post your prayer request. I would love to pray for you, and so are all the Glow Girls who read the Glow Girl blog. Struggle number 2, isolation. It is tough. But girls, here's what you need to remember. God wants to use that struggle to make you stronger, just like He did with Joseph. Well, next week we'll talk about struggle number 3. But until then, know this. I'm praying for you. I love you. And I'll see you right here next week again on Front Porch Friday. Bye, girl.